Here we are. That's right. Another pleasant autumn afternoon. A day after the Australian election. And the rise phoenix-like of a divided nation from the political ashes. I think it's important that we don't see this as an aberration. What we're seeing today is nothing new. Australian history, since colonisation began, has been a history of creating a uniform society. It's no accident that people you see supporting divided nation are those very people who believe they've been left on the margins, and they're correct. Historically, Australians have always been on the margins. And if you look at Australian history since Federation in 1901, we've seen this constant battle between the immigrant, the original colonisers, and First Nations people. So what we are seeing is nothing new. In the 30s we saw the rise of the New Guard, which was basically a fascist movement which supported both Mussolini and Hitler, which had a lot of support in Australia. So what we've seen is nothing new. But what we need is to make a diagnosis. If you're involved in medicine or whatever you're involved in, you need to make a diagnosis before you can actually look at the range of cures, in inverted commas. Without a diagnosis, you're basically wasting your time. So what we need to look at is what is behind the rise of divided nation after the Australian Labor Party had a historic electoral victory 12 months ago. So what has changed, or what hasn't changed? And that's the key, what hasn't changed? We need to understand that around the world we are seeing political, social, cultural movements which are fighting against corporatisation and globalisation and privatisation and deregulation. Now these movements, to a significant degree, are on the rise. But the dilemma is, in all these movements, whether it's reform in England or the Washington buffoons crowd in the United States of America, or divided nation in Australia, the issue is that they are looking at the very people who have caused the growing inequality in our society to resolve their issues. It's no secret some of the richest people in this country are major donors for divided nation. It's no secret that we have large segments of the Australian media, the Murdoch media, which is very keen to support divided nation, not because of its economic policies, but because they see them as a Trojan horse via which to destroy any real opposition to globalisation, corporatisation, deregulation and privatisation. But the first thing is we need to define these fancy words. What's globalisation? Well, globalisation is very simple, as we've seen with the current combat mission in the Middle East, in inverted commas. It's about ensuring the world's economy is totally interlinked. It's about giving away sovereign power to international bodies which are not created to improve the situation, which are created to ensure the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication continue to set the agenda. Corporatisation is very simple. Walk into any mega metropolis of consumption in this country, any major shopping mall, And you'll see the same brands, and if you see different brands, they're usually subsidiaries of the major brands. That's what corporatisation is. Now, I know we love to think that Australia relies on small business to survive, that it employs, I think, over 7 million people, half the population. That may be the fact, but the people who are making the economic killing are the corporations which dominate those fields, whether it's shopping, whether it's goods, whether it's services. Then you have privatisation. Well, we've seen privatisation. We were told that if public institutions are inefficient, it's a waste of public money, and if we give away these institutions to the private sector, they will provide goods and services at a reduced rate. Electricity, gas are classical examples. Telecommunications. And what we've seen is the privatisation of many aspects of everyday life, which has increased prices. And then you have deregulations. Now, in the majority of cases, regulations are put in place to protect people or the environment. So who is interested in promoting these forces? Who has profited? At whose expense? And why can't the so-called major political parties provide any protection against the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication? That's where the role of divided nation steps in. Divided nation is a sponge. It picks up that section of the Australian population that's been marginalised, shunned, ignored. That's what it picks up. It picks up that general dissatisfaction with the situation we find ourselves in 2026, where we have seen that the parliamentary system, the law-making capacity in this country, has been hijacked by the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. And we've seen the introduction of law after law after law after law, which puts their interests, that's corporate interests, before the interests of the public. Now, here at Public Interest Before Corporate Interest, we have been speaking about this for over a decade. And the organisation was formed in 2015 for that very reason. Now, obviously, we have not been successful in alerting people to where the real danger lies. It's much easier to soak up dissatisfaction with the current situation by blaming the other sections of our society, and that's why I talk about divided nation. And the whole purpose of divided nation is to attract a certain percentage of the population to policies which divide us on the basis of nationality, language spoken, religion, sexuality, and the list goes on and on. It's much, much, much easier to pick on somebody who you can visualise, who you see every day, and blame them for the predicament you find yourself in. In many regards, the Australian people, and that includes me and you, have created this situation because we have acquiesced to the idea that it's only the private sector which can provide for the needs of the community. The private sector is a little bit like inviting a third person to share your bed, because they need to make a profit. That's what that's what it's about. Private interest, private investment, private profit. And who has profited? during the corporatisation, globalisation, privatisation, deregulation revolution which continues to sweep over just over Australia, but large sections of the globe. Who have profited? Who hasn't profited? Why haven't they profited? Well, it's obvious in every available statistical indicator. The 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication have made the greatest strides forward. Even during COVID, they were able to soak up public funds to increase their profits at the expense of the community. So today, in a society as rich as Australia, 27 million people living on a resource-rich continent, we find ourselves in a situation where we have private charities raising money to send Australian kids to public schools. We have 35,000 registered charities raising money for a variety of issues. We see public money being pumped into private schools and private hospitals and private institutions. We see a financial sector which is totally deregulated, where nobody takes responsibility for anything. Nothing highlights this in the 2008 financial crisis, where not one banker was charged with any crime, or the robo-debt fiasco, where nobody was charged for any crime. But if you go out and shoplift in a court, you will be charged and prosecuted. And if you look at the bulging prison population in this country, and it is increasing rapidly, most of the prisoners are not violent criminals. The great majority of people involved in petty property crime, recidivists. And then ultimately, we find ourselves in a situation where governments are not willing to act to ensure there's enough taxation revenue to look after the basic interests of the people in this country. A government's responsibility is not only to provide personal security for external invasion or internal dissension, but its responsibility is to provide economic security for its people, both citizens and permanent residents. And successive governments have failed, and those governments which have been elected on platforms of resolving these issues continue to kowtow, not doff their caps, but kowtow to that 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. Look at the current situation. There is hesitancy among the Albanese Labor government to introduce a super profit tax on the gas industry, which is making billions of dollars as a result of the invasion, the war conducted by Israel and the United States in Iran and Lebanon and the rest of the Middle East. They are making billions of dollars of super profits because of the lack of fuel and gas. But no super profit tax. Look at all those corporations that exploit this country's mineral resources. We don't ride on the sheep's back anymore. We ride on natural resources. And how they pay peppercorn royalties, peppercorn taxes. Well, the community as a whole suffers. So when people find themselves in a situation, as we've seen in the South Australian election, and as we will see at the end of the year in the Victorian election, and the federal election in 2 years' time, when people find themselves marginalised and ostracised and criticised for being unhappy with the situation they find themselves in, and all we can do is not look at the reasons for the rise phoenix-like of One Nation in 2026, 30 years after it was created. We need to understand what's going on in our country today. And it's up to people like us to raise the alternative. Not an alternative based on kowtowing to the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. It's about asking the hard questions of divided nation. Do you support the Washington buffoon in the United States of America and his policies in the Middle East? Do you support the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication? Do you support the increasing gap between the rich and poor in this country? And that's the reality. The fact is the divided nation may have some state-based policies, but has no national policies which will resolve the major issue facing us as a nation, as a sovereign nation state in 2026. And that issue isn't identity politics, and that issue isn't the woeful situation First Nations people find themselves in their own country. But the major issue, the major way to break the back of those who somehow think that supporting divided nation is going to resolve their problems and enrich them, all they need to do is look at the situation in the United States of America, where the election of the buffoon in Washington has not help them. The fact is that we need to raise ideas that put the public interests before corporate interests. Public means the interests of the many. Unfortunately, in this country, public means second rate. If you talk about public housing, you talk about second-rate housing. You talk about public schools, you talk about second-rate schooling. You talk about public hospitals, you talk about second-rate hospitals. You talk about public health, you talk about second-rate health care. And the issue isn't that these institutions cannot deliver. They can deliver if they have the appropriate resources. They can deliver if they have the appropriate staff. The privatisation agenda has failed miserably. 50 years later, it's time it's thrown out on the garbage heap. The divided nation has no answers apart from division. It is supported by the very people that have created the inequality that we see today. So it's important for each and every one of us, whether you're a member of a political party or not, to actually analyse the situation, find out where the problems lie, and begin, that's right, begin from scratch that struggle to ensure public interests, that's the interests of the many, are put before corporate interests, the interests of the few. If we don't do that, we will create a divided nation, and we will continue to be exploited by the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, who currently set the parliamentary agenda and will continue to set the parliamentary agenda. Whether the ALP is in power, the Liberal National Party is in power, One Nation is in power, and possibly even if the Greens are in power. Because ultimately, democracy isn't rule of the people, by the people, for the people. There is one very important phrase which is left out of that definition. Democracy is rule of the people, by the people, for the people, by an engaged public. And while we see the public engaged in political, social and cultural rhetoric which divides us as a people and doesn't point the stick at those responsible for the marginalisation, anxiety, ostracisation which we see in our society, and that is the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication, who are great supporters of divided nation, because while we fight amongst ourselves on the basis of religion or race or gender or sexuality, they continue to rake in the cash and continue to set the parliamentary agenda.